Thank you for inviting me. Today, I'm going to talk about a small aspect of research we've been doing in our organization into the concrete functionality of digital democracy tools. First, however, I'd like to say a few words about why we do this, because it does tie very much into political theory. For many years, we've been repeating the mantra, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And shockingly, we've ended up with some relatively few rich people and a lot of relatively poor people. The chasm we watched be created for so long is now pretty noticeable, even to the extent that it's actually become largely self-perpetuating. Scholars like Thomas Piketty have even directly made this connection, showing that social classes are becoming so confined and inheritance so important that we're almost back to an era where people married for wealth. And because of that, we see politics following that economic development. A society where fortunes change a lot, are the more subject to individual effort, sees more political fluidity and moderation than we're beginning to see. This has been a mainstay of democratic thought, basically forever, that ensuring identity between people who make laws and people who are affected by them goes a long way to preventing factionalism and abuse. If you want your society to stay together, then it helps, at least to some extent, if everyone suffers and gains together. But the few rich and many poor, even if they're not desperately poor, scenario starts a situation in which people have different class interests, and they expect those interests to remain static. Rather than living a life where you will hopefully never live on welfare, you live a life where you feel so sure that that will never be you, that you view others as almost alien, completely apart from yourself in this matter. Similarly, if you live a life where you know you'll never attend a private school, people who do so kind of live on a different planet. What's important to remember is that this isn't just something people have imagined. It's also just like a reflection of reality. The factions exist in real life. So, of course, this is beginning to be reflected in politics. So, how do we react to this? After all, it creates a very unstable situation. And historically, societies where there is a large cleft between social groups, democracy is more unstable and politics are more high stakes. There's an idea that one or the other of those factions is controlling the country and the others are the enemy. Confronted in many Western countries with a rising majority or near majority that disagrees with them, be that Italy or Britain or the United States, the elite, so the top 20% or so reaction, has been to label those people populists and begin questioning the value of majority rule. It is sought to redefine majority rule as populism and democracy as a system of government that can exist in opposition to the popular will and majority rule. Majoritarian positions that are unpopular with elites are frequently described as uninformed, unconsidered, just about the numbers, lacking an understanding of the complexity of decision making, or endangering some other values that are said to be democratic. In order to prevent these false decisions from being made, it's variously been suggested that voters be required to take a test in order to exclude the uneducated from voting, as Jason Brennan, for example, philosopher, has suggested, that preferences simply be adjusted to align with those of the elite, which are assumed to be a priori correct. So, for example, Brian Kaplan makes that suggestion, that we accept rule by a virtuous, enlightened elite selected by exam, as per philosopher Daniel Abel, that civil society and identity politics play an increasing role in decision making at the expense of irrational individuals. So that would be Ahan and Bertals making that, professors making that suggestion, or that decision making be limited to a very small number of randomly selected, expert guided citizens who are to be insulated from the consequences of their decisions, which has become very, very popular among those who favor sortition and citizens' assemblies. It's not popular among the general population, but it is popular among them. So, in other words, elites have chosen to pursue a strategy of intense factionalism, explicitly focused on excluding those they dislike from politics and insisting that those people they dislike are not part of democracy. This could, of course, well lead to the populist faction retaliating. The problem we're confronted with is not that elite fears are entirely misguided or like incorrect in essence, but that they're largely self-created through their efforts to cast off popular rule and deploy extreme measures of control to prevent populism, that is, the other non-elite side, from winning, in a way that will probably ultimately backfire. Thus, our challenge is how to get back to democracy, which of course means majority rule, but in a constructive way. We've been working on this for a long time, essentially running and analyzing digital tools that facilitate participation and majority rule in a lot of different ways. Over the past 4 years, our institute has been taking a descriptive approach, documenting the capabilities which exist across a variety of software platforms. In doing so, we cast the net wide and included any process which allows citizens or residents of a country or community to interact with their public political institutions. So, for example, this could include software that's just online voting, so you cast your vote over your cell phone. Or it could include online public consultations or more complex forms of decision making, where people discuss and vote on a variety of public issues. We purposely did not initially take a normative approach to this research. So, for example, we didn't define what those democratic processes ideally should be. As part of our research, for the second edition of the SDI report, which was published in February 2021, we evaluated 22 vendors across 6 functionality areas, broken down into 31 sub-areas, their mission and vision, broken down into 3 sub-areas, their ability to execute, broken down into 8 sub-areas, and an IT security review. Overall, the report utilized 94 criteria to quantify civic democracy tech across these areas. The research revealed a maturity democracy industry with sophisticated functionality across a wide array of application areas, including online decision-making and deliberation, participatory budgeting, idea generation, public consultation, and the automation of government tasks. We also, for the first time, conducted interviews with clients of the various software vendors, primarily local government institutions, such as local councils and NGOs. While these interviews were mainly carried out to measure aspects such as customer satisfaction, intuitiveness of the platforms, et cetera, they also highlighted that many organizations were not making much use of the more innovative features of these platforms, such as discussions, multi-option voting, or geographic voter analysis. But instead, they were playing it safe, often using their chosen product primarily as a conventional survey tool. So, in other words, to gather data rather than really let citizens take part in the decision-making process. It was possible to do this because most software platforms are designed to be toolkits, giving their clients the ability to pick and choose which components to utilize, rather than an integrated end-to-end process, which would force more active democratic participation. At the same time, local authorities are incentivized, and in some cases actually required by law, to involve more citizens in politics. So sometimes tools are used in order to tick a box rather than as part of an integrated platform. As a result, a minimalist version of a product is often used. This might be a minimum viable product in technical terms, but possibly not in social terms. We believe that there's a real risk that more direct forms of democracy, when undermined in this fashion, can be seen to be ineffective. And as they don't deliver on the depth of the participation originally envisaged, they'll find fewer and fewer participants interested in taking part. In order to ensure that the democracy platforms available today can deliver on driving deeper and wider democratic participation and contributing to overcoming the social issues outlined earlier, that's in bridging the existing factionalism in a constructive manner, we've therefore developed a set of supplementary normative criteria, which measure the actual effectiveness of these software tools against democratic impact goals. Basically, like the historical Solon, we're trying not to let one faction or the other get it all their own way. In the interests of the populists, we have preventing elite capture, incentivizing participation, and efficiency. And in the interests of the elites, we have accountability, civility, and structure. This analysis is a work in progress. When we started it, we noticed that we had to exclude some of the software we've previously analyzed because it focused more on task automation or data structuring rather than participation. And we also have others where we haven't finished collecting the data yet from our side. However, This still leaves us at the moment with 14 pieces of civil society software. We also included 3 social media sites that can technically be used for decision-making purposes to see if there are differences that we could note there. So as you can see, the scores for efficiency and effectiveness were quite high across the board, even for social media. So the ability to set up a decision fast, have an intuitive interface for users, and transparently publish results was something well within the range of most tools, and a criterion that didn't really lead to much distinguishing between them, which is unsurprising. If they didn't have that ability, they just wouldn't be as widely used as they are in fact used. Well, there was a lot more variation was under the category elite capture versus majority rule. Almost all of these tools could be used in ways where ideas bubbled up from the bottom and where the organizing body could commit to implementing decisions. But they could also be used without doing any of that. In other words, they could be used in a rather elitist manner to countermand or ignore majority decisions. So that refers to equality between users and administrators. Something we also looked at was the equality between users of these platforms. And one of the things that was very different between civic tech and conventional social media was that most conventional social media, be that Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter, is about collecting followers. The more followers you have, the more influence you get. So some sites like Twitter even encourage this by handing out blue check marks to people at their own discretion. While this was originally intended to prevent confusion between real people and parody accounts, it's since become a status symbol, given out to people who aren't at risk of being parodied, but usually work for some kind of legacy institution like a legacy newspaper or a legacy broadcaster. Many accounts, at least on Twitter, no longer even make a pretense of engaging with people, but try to maximize their followers while minimizing people they are following. And as we know, this has resulted in exacerbating precisely those issues we're addressing in this paper. Forming into factions, intimidating others from a power base, and giving a huge edge to people who have money or fame in some other area. Or, for example, they belong to an important organization, or at least they have the leisure to tweet 80,000 times. New members tend to start from a position of inequality, like deep inequality, that makes their use of these tools ineffective. Most of the civic decision-making software does not allow for these kinds of hierarchies to be created. Instead, there's a kind of Groundhog Day effect, where the process gets reset to 0. You may be able to build a certain reputation on platforms, where you can continue using the same identity, so people might recognize you after a while, but you can't build yourself a louder voice automatically. And interestingly, these civic tech platforms report practically none of the problems we identify with social media. So intimidation, mirroring, or even exaggerating pre-existing factions or rude and spurious contributions. Even tools with hundreds of thousands of users, and some of them have had that many users, report that these problems are ones that they just practically never encounter. That may change because they still don't have as many users as Facebook or Twitter. But it is a striking difference. And we believe that is because that they de facto prevent the formation of an elite within the system. And strategies of intimidation and witch hunting don't work well or as well when there is a high degree of equality among users. Going hand in hand with this were differences in incentivizing participation. People often say that social media is addictive, but that's only true for a certain kind of person who likes arguing or self-promoting. The vast majority of people don't have an interest in self-promotion because they work for someone else and they aren't trying to drive business. And in fact, it could be detrimental for them to draw too much attention to themselves or to become too controversial. Unfortunately, what this can lead to is a kind of fade out among the rest of the participants. So the elites kind of muscle other people out by being very aggressive. And because the average person doesn't have a really strong incentive to stay on social media and fight it out, they just kind of fade into the background and eventually they might stop using the tool altogether. So the civic tech platforms try to incentivize people to participate in other ways. A lot of them that we examined, they would really try to encourage public officials to follow up with what they did as a result of public consultation or some other form of engagement. But what they would often get was the officials publishing something really vague, like, oh, we took the feedback into account, which didn't accomplish that goal at all. Some of the platforms which had more functionality would try to nudge people to do things that they might be interested in. So for example, they might send people an email and say, you've said that you're interested in the topic of education, and there's a consultation on education that's being held. Would you be interested in participating in it? So that would be one way that you could kind of nudge people to participate in things that they've said that they're interested in. But generally speaking, it has to be said, a lot more can be done in closing the gap between just participating and something concrete happening because of that participation. A final thing that kind of surprised us when looking at this angle is how well the petition platforms performed. This is something we had actually tended to overlook in the past, the humble petition platform. And I think that's because there were fads, petition fads like Uplift or Change.org, and those became really associated with progressive causes, and therefore they were much less representative than they were originally intended to be. And they just didn't attract voters who were interested in other topics. But they also just didn't have the follow through mechanism that you would need to make something like this work. And there was, in addition to that, there was also a real rage 8 or 10 years ago for government online petition platforms. So Obama set up a petition mechanism for the White House. The UK Parliament set up a petition mechanism. But the British one had a very lengthy and convoluted procedure, which created problems with people using it. And the American one would just result in an official reply, which was just basically the same as the policy that everyone already knew. So it was really uninteresting. So those things really weren't interactive enough, and they didn't let people follow through the process. And I think because of that, we kind of gave up on the petition, especially the online petition. Whereas now we see some petition platforms in Eastern Europe, particularly in Estonia and Latvia, that do include a fairly end-to-end process. People are putting up a petition for other people to sign. The instrumentation to identity check is incorporated into that, so you can check that the person who's signing it is a citizen of the country. And there is follow through, which is usually a debate in Parliament. And in the case, so if enough people sign the petition, it has to be debated in Parliament. And in the case of Latvia, the person who put the petition up even gets to call their own experts to that debate. So that's making for a much stronger process to allow so-called populism to flow into the government process. Another reason the petition platform scored so well was that unlike most other platforms, they lacked the possibility for too much control in the ideation phase. So in many other platforms, decision options could be set by an outside power, even if they didn't have to be, which was not the case for petitions. So in conclusion, we come back to our tried and trusted political philosophy. If you want to live in a democracy, you can't afford to let a gap between elites and non-elites build. Democracy tools should not allow a hierarchy to be built between users. Things like liquid democracy, whereby one could empower other users to vote on one's behalf, are not a good idea. Resetting equality does make for slightly less efficiency, but the efficiency levels are already high enough that that isn't really a concern. Follow through is also important. If you can't incentivize people to participate based on the power they would gain, you have to think of some other way to do so. One of the most successful ways so far has been to feed participation into the conventional representative system, but in such a way that it's difficult to ignore. Finally, by providing a wide array of functionality, democracy tools can appeal to a broader category of decision makers. However, this is something of a double-edged sword, as it also carries the risk of administrators acting negligently or even in bad faith and thus subverting the process or turning it into mere window dressing. Is more functionality always better? Is therefore a question that needs to be considered. While there are still challenges, the civic tech that exists already goes a long way to bridging this gap and structuring populism into meaningful but constructive political outcomes. We shouldn't be trying to control populism and stopping democracy, but rather trying to bridge the gap between elite and non-elite participants. Thank you.